Talk about an idea that I feel was pushed onto a lot of us as younger fans of the X-Men, and that is that Magneto is kind of a stand-in for Malcolm X, and Charles Xavier is a stand-in for Martin Luther King Jr. The thing that many people have talked about before is how this sort of dumbs down the messaging of these two men, how it sort of pacifies and calms down what Martin Luther King Jr. actually had to say, and how it demonizes Malcolm X. And oftentimes get so caught up in that conversation, we don't listen to the writer who crafted the backstory of Magneto as a Holocaust survivor, Chris Claremont. Chris is kind of the person that put some meat on the bones of this character, crafting something more interesting there when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee just kind of made a very stereotypical villain who believed in mutant supremacy, but Chris provided the why behind that supremacy. Listen to Chris talk, he's made the comparison to two different men who would become the prime minister of Israel who had somewhat different views. David Ben-Gurion, who was kind of the stand-in for Professor X, terrorist turned prime minister Menachem Begin. That presents a very interesting conversation about the portrayal of Charles, because Ben-Gurion was the first Israeli prime minister. He is the person who oversaw the theft of land and the Nakba. They're presenting us with a good guy and a bad guy, but they are two sides of the same coin of Zionism. On a source on this, it's not hard to find. There's this interview from back in 2000 with Claremont. Laid out very clearly here how he felt. My view of Magneto is that he's a terrorist who might someday evolve into a statesman. I think that presents an interesting idea that Menachem himself actually evolved, because you look at Magneto as a character, he becomes an anti-hero, hell, he even becomes a hero. This man was still essentially a terrorist even in 1977 when he took over as prime minister. If you go back to the 1940s, he was in charge of Irgun, which was a Jewish terrorist organization. They did things like the King David Hotel bombing. Killed 91 people, hurt 46 more, Jews, Arabs, and British alike. Just like Magneto, this is a man who lost his family to the Holocaust. In 1942, he had the choice to stay in Europe and fight the Nazis or go to Palestine and fight for the establishment of a Jewish state. He chose to go to Palestine and become a terrorist. Said as a prime minister, still essentially a terrorist, authorized the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, including the Sabra massacre, which I talked about all the way back when Brave New World was coming about, when we were talking about the character of Sabra and why people had such a deep issue with this on so many levels. This was a massacre of up to 3,500 Palestinian and Lebanese Shia Muslims by Christian militias supported by the IDF. That is the type of person Chris is thinking about as motivation for Magneto. Was asked in another interview, a major theme of your X-Men stories was using mutants as a metaphor for other persecuted groups. Where did that idea come from? His response was this. Follow-up question there was, with the X-Men, were you only thinking about anti-Semitism or racism and homophobia as well? He goes on to talk about the idea of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. He said, it's totally valid, but for me, being an immigrant white, he was born in England, to make that analogy felt incredibly presumptuous. An equivalent analogy could be made to Menachem Begin as Magneto evolving through his life from a terrorist in 1947 to a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize 30 years later. He goes on to talk about a moment where Magneto is thinking, what kind of monster have I become? Has what the Nazis did to me in the Shoah made me a Nazi? Interesting, because when Menachem visited the United States in 1948, he was met by an open letter which was signed by many prominent American Jewish thinkers, rabbis as well, and it opened to the editors of the New York Times. Among the most disturbing political phenomena of our times is the emergence in the newly created state of Israel of the Freedom Party, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. I want to talk about atrocities committed against Arab civilians. The letter is long and thorough, but it ends, the undersigned therefore take this means of publicly presenting a few salient facts concerning Begin and his party, and of urging all concerned not to support this latest manifestation of fascism, signed by Albert Einstein, Sidney Hook, among others. Talking about this comparison, you're talking about someone who goes through immense pain and trauma and persecution and loses family, and then on the other side comes out basically violent and unfeeling and concerned that in the future that could happen again. So they make sure they do everything they can to stop that from happening, and they do not care who gets hurt along the way. See, lost in those ideas were the 750,000 Palestinians that were expelled from their homes in 1948. See, one of the people responsible for that is our stand-in for Charles Xavier, our hero, right? And that is David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel. He is the person who created the IDF. See, then we're not supposed to believe that this man was not also involved in terrorism. In 1948, he oversaw Operation Cast Thy Bread, when the Israelis were using biological warfare, poisoning the wells of Palestinians. This around villages that they captured, around land that they stole so that people would not want to return, and they used typhoid to do it. This was illegal biological warfare, this was terrorism, and he signed off on it. A man who in 1938 said this. And who in 1956 told Nahum Goldman, "Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true, but 2,000 years ago, and what that to them? There have been the Nazis, but what was that their fault? They only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that?" These are the words of our pacifist, right? And in the comics, Chris has Charles and Magneto meet in a hospital in Israel. Ben Gurion, who was peaceful, right, was obsessed with Israel having nuclear weapons. So under his reign, he oversaw their secret nuclear program, which put him into conflict with John F. Kennedy, who said this can't be happening, and he threatened the United States' support of Israel over this issue. All this being said, I've just scratched the surface of this topic, but I think it's worth more examination, more thought, and more discussion. Stan Lee created the character. Claremont is the one that shaped him and largely shaped his relationship with Charles, and I don't think this is talked about enough.